My name is Daniel Harper, and the night it happened, I was already wide awake. Not because of the neon glow outside my loft in Brooklyn, but because of the text that sliced through the dark like a blade. It was 12:41 a.m., and my phone lit up with words that made my chest seize. Danny, about Thanksgiving. Your sister Morgan has everything planned, and she thinks it's best if you don't come. I stared at the screen rereading as if maybe the letters would rearrange into something reasonable. My hands trembled, not out of sadness, but disbelief. 6 months earlier, I had saved my parents' home from foreclosure. Not just any home, but the cedar-shingled place in Vermont that held every childhood memory I had. And now, I was being told I wasn't welcome for Thanksgiving dinner there. Another buzz. This one felt colder. Morgan says your presence might make things awkward. She's inviting some high-profile clients from her firm. Please understand. The tone was syrupy, but I knew better. I could practically hear Morgan's voice behind it, perfectly poised, yet dripping with that brand of condescension she had mastered since we were kids. Growing up, she was the golden child, the one who got a gap year when she flunked out of college halfway through, the one who charged $70,000 on my parents' cards for networking events in LA and Miami. Meanwhile, I was the one patching roofs in the summer and working night shifts during college. 15 years in software engineering taught me to wear thrift store coats and funnel every spare dollar into investments. When the call came last winter, it wasn't from Morgan, it was from Dad. His voice cracked as he explained they were about to lose the house. I didn't hesitate. I sold my small rental property in Queens, liquidated a brokerage account I'd been building since I was 23, and wired $480,000 to clear their mortgage. They promised to pay me back, swore I had saved them. Mom cried into the phone. You're our rock, Danny. And now I was apparently too much of a liability for Morgan's perfect dinner party. The very idea of me sitting at that table with my blunt opinions about her spending habits was too much for her carefully crafted image. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out at the Brooklyn Bridge, lit against the Black River, and felt something shift in me. This wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about years of being told to keep the peace while Morgan's chaos went unchecked. It was about every holiday where my achievements were background noise to her latest big deal that never materialized. I thought about how many times I'd swallowed my pride to protect them from her mistakes, and for what to be cast aside the moment I might inconvenience her. Not this time. This time there would be consequences. And before I tell you what happened next, I want to know, have you ever been pushed out of your own family's life, even after sacrificing everything for them? Share your story below, because I promise you're not alone in this. The truth is, that night I wasn't just angry. I was clear. I had a legal document tucked away that my lawyer made my parents sign when I saved their house. At the time they were desperate and grateful, now they probably didn't even remember the fine print. But I did. And as I put my phone down and opened the small safe in my closet, I knew the words on that paper were about to change everything. They had 6 months. 6 months to buy back the house from me at market value or begin paying rent. That clock had just run out. I closed the safe, exhaled slowly, and reached for my phone again, not to text Morgan, but to call someone who would help me take the first step toward reclaiming more than just a house. I was about to reclaim my place in my own story. I didn't sleep that night. The city outside was quiet, but inside my head the noise was deafening. Memories kept flashing: birthdays, Christmas mornings, family cookouts, each one with a common thread. Morgan in the center, me on the sidelines. I got up before sunrise, made a pot of black coffee, and sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to fire off a reply, something sharp, something that would sting. But another part of me, the part that had been silent too long, knew this wasn't about a text war. This was about drawing a line in stone, not sand. Morgan had been managing the family narrative for years. She was the charming one, the rainmaker, the one my parents bragged about at church, even when the facts didn't match the story. And me, I was responsible, the fixer, the one they called when the wheels came off, always behind the scenes, always cleaning up. I poured another cup and opened my laptop. The legal agreement was still there, filed neatly in my personal folder. 6 months ago, my attorney, Richard Holt, had warned me, if you're going to do this, protect yourself. Desperation makes people promise anything. He was right. In their panic, Mom and Dad had signed a binding contract. It wasn't vindictive, it was protection. For years I'd watched them enable Morgan's reckless spending while quietly draining their retirement savings. This document was my insurance policy, against that cycle swallowing them and me whole. I sipped my coffee and thought about how this would play out. Sending the notice wouldn't just be a legal move, it would be a statement. A reminder that generosity is not a bottomless well, and that even family has limits when boundaries are crossed. And that's when I realized this wasn't just my story anymore. There are so many people out there who give until they're empty, who keep the peace at the expense of their own peace. People like you, maybe. If you've ever been in that position, sacrificing your own stability to rescue someone else only to be treated like you don't matter, I want you to speak up. Drop a comment with "I get it" if you've been there. Let's see how many of us have been told to shrink ourselves just to keep someone else comfortable. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this is only the beginning. I leaned back in my chair, letting that thought settle. For too long, I'd been reactive, stepping in when Morgan burned through another credit card, smoothing things over, when she embarrassed the family at a wedding, covering the property tax bill when Mom called in tears. Every time I helped, I delayed the moment they'd have to face reality. Not anymore. This time they would feel the weight of their choices. The phone rang. It was Mom. I didn't answer. She'd leave a voicemail filled with soft reassurances that this wasn't personal, that Morgan was just stressed. I'd heard it all before. I couldn't let that script play again. Instead, I opened my contacts and tapped Richard's number. "Richard, it's Danny," I said when he picked up. My voice was steady, almost calm. "Send the formal notice today. They're out of time." He didn't hesitate. "Understood. Want me to arrange delivery?" "Yes," I said. "Make sure it lands during her dinner party." There was a pause, then a faint chuckle. "You're making a point." "I'm drawing a line," I corrected. "One they can't pretend isn't there." After we hung up, I felt lighter, not happy but clear. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my place, my respect, and my boundaries. The sun was breaking over the East River, now casting gold on the water. I watched it for a long moment, thinking about how in a few days, Morgan's perfect Thanksgiving tableau would fracture. And maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally have a seat at the table. I closed the laptop and poured the last of my coffee. Time to get ready for work. Life wouldn't pause for this fight, but I was ready for it. By the time I got home from work that evening, the decision I'd made that morning had sunk in. There was no turning back now. The wheels were in motion and the countdown had begun. I went straight to the bedroom closet and reached for the small fireproof safe tucked behind a stack of old moving boxes. The dial clicked under my fingers, each turn echoing in the quiet room. Inside was the folder, thin, unassuming, but worth nearly $500,000 in leverage. 6 months ago, when I'd bailed my parents out, they hadn't just been grateful, they'd been desperate. Their home was weeks away from foreclosure, their savings already drained. Morgan's failed business ventures had left them with a mountain of debt, and their own bad investments had nearly buried them. When I offered to step in, I made sure it was under one condition, a signed legal agreement, stating I held the deed until they either bought it back at market value or started paying rent within 6 months. At the time, it felt almost cruel to bring in a lawyer. But Richard had been adamant. "Danny, you're not punishing them. You're protecting yourself from becoming their permanent bailout fund." And now, as the clock ran out, I was grateful I'd listened. I placed the folder on my desk and flipped it open. There it was, page after page of signatures, clauses, and deadlines in black and white. The power was in the details, and every detail was airtight. But the folder wasn't just the contract. Over the past half year, I'd been quietly building something else, a thick file of evidence. Screenshots of text messages where Morgan asked Mom for just a little cash before a luxury trip to Aspen. Bank statements showing withdrawals from my parents' retirement account that coincidentally lined up with her shopping sprees. Even a receipt for a custom-ordered Tesla bought 2 months after my bailout. Looking at it all laid out, I felt the familiar churn of anger and exhaustion. This was my family, and yet the pattern was so clear it was almost clinical. Morgan would overspend, charm her way into another extension, and Mom and Dad would bend until they broke. Then I'd step in to fix it, and the cycle would start again. Not this time. This time there would be no rescue without accountability. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the skyline beyond my window. Brooklyn at night was a symphony of light and noise, people moving, living, surviving. And here I was about to drop a legal hammer on my own blood. It wasn't a choice I made lightly, but it was the only way to stop enabling the slow-motion collapse of the people I loved. I thought back to the night I signed the wire transfer. I'd been sitting in this same chair telling myself I was doing the right thing. That family comes first. But what I hadn't realized was that putting them first had pushed me so far down my own list that I'd disappeared. Now I was taking myself off the bottom rung. The phone buzzed. A message from an old college friend popped up. "Hey man, saw you haven't posted in a while. Everything good?" I almost laughed. Everything was changing. That was the better word. I typed back a short reply, then reached for the folder again. This wasn't about embarrassing Morgan or humiliating my parents. It was about forcing all of us to face the truth. Tomorrow, Richard would send the notice, and when that happened, the fantasy of Morgan's control, the spotless image she'd been selling to the world, would start to crack. I closed the folder, slid it back into the safe, and locked it. My hands felt steady for the first time in months. In 2 days, she'd host her Thanksgiving dinner, all crystal glasses and curated playlists, laughing for her clients like the perfect hostess. And right in the middle of it, the truth would walk through the front door in a manila envelope. And I'd be somewhere else entirely, breathing air she couldn't touch. The morning of Thanksgiving Eve arrived crisp and gray, the kind of cold that bites through your coat the second you step outside. I woke earlier than usual, not because I had anywhere to be, but because anticipation had replaced sleep. Today was the last calm before the storm. As I sipped my coffee, my phone lit up with a group text from my parents. "Morgan's dinner is going to be beautiful. We'll miss you, Danny, but we'll celebrate later. Okay?" The message was polite, even sweet on the surface, but I could feel the subtext dripping between the lines. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. There was a time when I would have taken the bait, maybe even apologized for making things awkward. But not now. Now I was done shrinking to make Morgan comfortable. Around mid-morning, Richard called. "Couriers confirmed for tomorrow evening," he said. "Envelope will be delivered to the host, signature required. Are you sure about this timing?" "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation. "They'll be in the middle of dinner. I want there to be no mistaking the moment reality arrives." He paused, then asked, "You ready for the fallout?" "More than ready," I said. "This isn't revenge, Richard. This is years overdue." After we hung up, I pulled out my suitcase. The Maldives had been a dream destination since college, but I'd always put it off. Too expensive, too indulgent, too selfish. This time, selfishness wasn't a sin. It was a statement. While Morgan played hostess to her curated crowd, I'd be boarding a plane to the other side of the world. By noon, my flight was booked first-class non-stop from JFK to Malé. I closed the booking confirmation and felt a strange sense of lightness, as if each keystroke had lifted another brick off my shoulders. But the day wasn't done testing me. At 2 p.m., my mom called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened as her voice wavered between guilt and justification. "Sweetheart, please. This is so important for your sister's career. She's finally making connections that could change her life. We'll make it up to you later." Later. That word had become the family mantra, a convenient placeholder for promises that were never kept. Later, we'll pay you back. Later, we'll acknowledge your help. Later, we'll celebrate you. But later never came. I set the phone down and leaned against the counter, my mind drifting through years of laters that dissolved into nothing. This time, my answer wouldn't be later, it would be now. By late afternoon, the suitcase was half packed. I added sunscreen, a paperback I'd been meaning to read, and my passport. Each item felt like another brick in the wall I was building between myself and the endless cycle of rescuing people who didn't want to be saved. As the sun dipped behind the skyline, the apartment filled with that orange-gold light New York does so well in the fall. I stood by the window looking out at the city's restless energy and thought about what tomorrow would bring. Somewhere in Vermont, Morgan would be fussing over table settings and wine pairings, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath her was about to shift. And me, I'd be miles in the air sipping champagne while the storm hit. For the first time in years, the thought didn't fill me with guilt. It filled me with peace. Thanksgiving morning dawned colder than the night before, the sky a pale, washed-out blue over the city. My suitcase sat by the door, zipped and ready. The only thing left was the waiting, and that's always been the hardest part for me. Waiting meant thinking, and thinking meant revisiting every moment that had led to this. I brewed coffee, the rich smell filling the apartment, and sat at the table with my laptop open. I didn't check the news. I didn't scroll social media. Instead, I opened the folder on my desktop labeled Records. There they were, months of screenshots, PDFs, and bank statements, transfers from my parents' retirement account into Morgan's personal checking, wire receipts for short-term loans that never came back, a scanned copy of a luxury Aspen timeshare contract signed just 3 weeks after I'd wired almost $500,000 to save their home. Looking at the files was like watching a slow-motion train wreck you've already lived through. It wasn't just the money, it was the pattern. The lies coded in charm. The emotional blackmail wrapped in just this once. The way everyone else bent so Morgan could keep walking in a straight line that never led anywhere. I closed the folder, exhaling through my nose. This wasn't about being petty or seeking revenge. It was about breaking a cycle. And I knew deep down that if I didn't act now, we'd be in the exact same place next year and the year after that. Some people won't change until the cost of staying the same outweighs the comfort of doing nothing. And I have to ask you, if you were in my shoes, what would you do? Would you keep the peace for the sake of a holiday meal? Or would you finally hold the line even if it meant blowing up the illusion? Let me know in the comments, because I think more of us have been in this position than we care to admit. The truth is, this isn't just a my family story. This is about anyone who's been told they're too intense, too dramatic, or too much for daring to demand accountability. It's about every person who's poured their time, money, and energy into someone who saw them as a resource instead of a human being. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Courier has the package. On schedule for delivery at 7:30 p.m. Perfect. Right in the middle of Morgan's dinner service, somewhere between the artisanal butternut squash soup and the grass-fed filet mignon. I could almost picture it, the knock on the door, the courier in a crisp jacket, the manila envelope passed over with a polite smile. Morgan, signing without thinking, still performing for her guests until she read the first line, until the color drained from her face, until she realized that the house she'd been parading as her own stage was never really hers to begin with. I set my coffee cup down and stood, running a hand over my jaw. The idea didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel steady. Like for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to Morgan's chaos, I was setting the terms. By noon, I'd finished packing. I double-checked my passport, my ticket, and the itinerary Richard had sent. Everything was in order. There was a certain irony to it all. Tomorrow, while Morgan's carefully curated evening unraveled, I'd be boarding a flight to one of the most beautiful places on Earth. For years, I'd put trips like that off, telling myself they were too much. But after everything, I realized something important: peace isn't something you wait for, it's something you claim. And tomorrow I'd be claiming mine at 35,000 feet. By early afternoon, the streets outside my building had thinned to a holiday hush. In New York, that's rare, like the city is collectively holding its breath. I sat by the window, my suitcase at my side, and watched the last-minute shoppers hustle past with bags of groceries and bouquets of flowers. Somewhere uptown, Morgan was probably fussing over her table settings, arranging name cards, just so making sure the lighting was perfect for her casual dinner party photos. I knew her game. Every event was another chance to showcase her curated life designer outfits, imported wines, a guest list sprinkled with just enough influencers to keep her social feeds buzzing. And always beneath the sparkle, the same old rot maxed-out cards, unpaid debts, and a trail of promises she'd never keep. I reached for my phone, scrolling through a few older texts from her. Hey, could you spot me a few hundred for a project? I'll pay you back Friday. It's just a temporary cash flow thing. You know I'm good for it. Friday would come and go. The project would vanish into thin air. And temporary was Morgan's favorite synonym for permanent. If you've ever had someone like that in your life, you know the exhaustion I'm talking about. It's not just financial, it's emotional. You start bracing for the next ask before it even arrives. You carry the weight of their chaos, like it's your own, because if you don't, you know it will crush the people you love even more. So I want to ask you, how do you know when it's time to stop catching someone who refuses to stand on their own? Tell me in the comments, because this is the line I've been walking for years, and I know I'm not the only one. I closed my messages and checked the clock. 3:17 p.m. My flight was tomorrow morning, which meant I had just one more night in the city before everything shifted. I'd already decided not to check my phone once I boarded. Whatever fallout came, I'd face it after I landed in the Maldives sun, on my face the Atlantic far behind me. Still, I couldn't help imagining the scene that would unfold in Vermont tomorrow night. The courier's knock, the scrape of the envelope across the polished wood table, Morgan's painted smile faltering as she skimmed the first paragraph. Guests pretending not to notice but leaning in just enough to catch the scent of scandal. And then, well, then they'd have to talk. Not the polite surface-level chatter my family had perfected, but real talk. The kind that burned away pretense. The kind they'd avoided for 15 years because it was easier to let Morgan run the show. For me, that conversation had already happened in my own head over and over. It always ended the same way, with me realizing that no matter how much I gave, it was never going to be enough. Because the hole Morgan was digging wasn't financial, it was behavioral. And the only way to fill it was for her to stop digging. I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the skyline. The city lights were beginning to flicker on one by one as the sky dimmed to navy. A cab honked down on the street, sharp and impatient. Life outside kept moving, indifferent to the drama unfolding in my family. For the first time in a long time, I felt aligned with that rhythm, steady, unhurried, unshaken. The decision was made. The plan was in motion. And tomorrow, while Morgan's perfect evening unraveled, I'd be stepping into something she couldn't touch: my own freedom. I stood, zipped my suitcase fully, and set it by the door. Whatever came next, I was ready. Thanksgiving Day broke with a sky the color of slate, heavy with the threat of snow. My alarm went off at 6:00 a.m. Not that I needed it, I'd barely slept. The air in my apartment felt sharper, charged with the kind of energy you get right before a storm. I showered, dressed, and brewed coffee, letting the steam curl into the cold morning air. The suitcase waited patiently by the door, my passport tucked neatly inside the front pocket. Every item was accounted for, every plan in place. Today wasn't just a holiday, it was the pivot point. At 9:00 a.m., my phone buzzed. Richard's name lit the screen. "Courier's on the road," he said. "ETA for delivery 7:30 p.m. That work for you?" "Perfect," I replied. My voice was steady, but I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. He hesitated. "They're going to come at you hard, Danny. Just be ready." "I've been ready for years," I said, and hung up. By mid-morning, the streets outside were quiet. Most people were already gathered around tables or traveling to see family. I ordered a late breakfast from the diner down the block: eggs, bacon, toast, but barely touched it. My mind kept drifting north to Vermont, to the house I had saved and the dinner I had been shut out of. I pictured it clearly: the dining room glowing with warm light, a fire snapping in the hearth. Morgan at the head of the table playing hostess with her usual precision. My parents smiling politely, maybe even a little relieved I wasn't there to disrupt the evening. Glasses, clinking silverware chiming against plates. And then the knock, the pause in conversation, the courier stepping into the doorway, manila envelope in hand. "Signature, please." Morgan still smiling for her guests, scribbling her name before tearing open the seal. The first page in her hands, the words sinking in, and the smile gone. That image sustained me. Not because I wanted her humiliated, but because I wanted the truth to finally take a seat at her perfect table. For too long, she'd hosted our lives like they were her stage production, the rest of us assigned bit parts. Tonight, the script would flip. Around noon, I decided to walk. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but it cleared my head. I passed brownstones with wreaths on their doors, the smell of roasting turkey drifting through open windows. Families were gathering, stories were being shared, and in Vermont, the Harper family drama was about to start its own chapter. Back at the apartment, I poured another coffee and stood by the window. The city stretched out in front of me, indifferent and alive. Somewhere in that sprawl was a version of me who would have let this go, swallowed the insult for the sake of keeping the peace. That version was gone. As the afternoon light began to fade, I felt a strange calm settle in. The storm was already on its way north. I didn't need to be there to see it hit. My part was done. All that was left was to step onto that plane tomorrow morning and put physical miles between me and the chaos I'd lived in for too long. Tonight, though, I'd allow myself one small satisfaction, knowing that by the time Morgan's guests reached dessert, the conversation at that table would be very, very different. By the time the clock crept toward 7:30 p.m., I was sitting cross-legged on my couch, a glass of bourbon in my hand, the city outside my window glowing with holiday lights. Somewhere hundreds of miles north, the courier would be pulling into the driveway of my parents' Vermont home. I imagined the scene in vivid detail: the crunch of tires on fresh snow, the sudden hush in the dining room when the knock came. Morgan's carefully rehearsed laugh freezing mid-sentence. My dad glancing toward the door, confused while my mom rose to answer it. And then, the courier's voice polite but firm. Package for Ms. Morgan Harper. Signature required. She'd sign without a second thought after all who would send her anything but praise. Maybe she'd even think it was a gift from one of her clients, something she could brag about to her guests. But as soon as she slid a finger under the seal and pulled out the documents, the air around that table would shift. My phone buzzed. I didn't even need to check to know who it was. First, a text from my mother. "What is this legal notice? Call us immediately." Then my father, "Danny, you can't do this to us. This is our home." And finally Morgan herself. "You're insane. You're ruining everything." I took a slow sip of bourbon, letting the burn settle in my chest before setting the glass down. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard, but instead of texting, I tapped the call button. Morgan answered on the first ring. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she snapped. Her voice was tight, panicked, nothing like the honeyed tone she used in public. "My boss and his wife are here. Do you have any idea?" "Yes," I cut in smoothly. "I know exactly what's happening, and I know exactly who's sitting at that table with you. That's why I chose tonight." There was a beat of silence broken only by the clatter of dishes in the background and my mother's voice rising somewhere behind her. "You could have waited until after the holidays," Morgan hissed. "And you could have paid rent like the agreement said," I replied. "Or bought the house back. 6 months, Morgan. I gave you 6 months." She scoffed. "You know we can't afford either." I leaned back against the couch. "You could if you sold your Tesla. Or those designer bags stacked in your closet. Or that Aspen timeshare you bragged about over dinner last month." "You've always been jealous of me," she spat. "Just because Mom and Dad love me more." "No," I said, my voice low and steady. "They don't love you more. They fear you more. The tantrums, the guilt trips, the way you've made them afraid to say no." There was no quick comeback this time, just the muffled sound of my father's voice tight with anger. It was the first time I'd heard that tone from him when talking to Morgan. "2 choices," I said before she could recover. "Buy the house at market value, or start paying rent January 1st. If not, the eviction process starts immediately. I'm done playing the quiet one." "You're destroying this family," she said finally, her voice cracking. "No, Morgan," I said, staring out at the glittering skyline. "I'm saving what's left of it." I ended the call before she could respond, set the phone face down, and took another sip of bourbon. The city hummed around me, the lights bright against the cold night. And somewhere in Vermont, Morgan's perfect dinner was unraveling one page of legal truth at a time. I woke up the next morning before sunrise, the city still wrapped in its pre-dawn quiet. My flight was just hours away, and for the first time in months, I didn't have to rush anywhere. The phone, however, had other plans. It was lit up with missed calls and messages. The group chat with my parents and Morgan had exploded overnight. Half of them were, "Please, Danny, we can work this out," and the other half were accusations. "You've humiliated us. You're selfish." But tucked between all that noise was one message that made me pause. It was from my grandmother. "Proud of you. Call me when you can." I dialed her immediately. She picked up on the first ring. "You should have seen the chaos you left behind," she said, and I could hear the smirk in her voice. "Your sister's boss saw everything. The envelope, her face when she read it. Priceless. That promotion she wouldn't shut up about gone." I sat back, letting her words sink in. Morgan had built her image like a house of glass, and last night someone had finally thrown the first stone. Grandma's tone softened. "Your father found her hidden credit card statements. The ones she opened in their names. I've never seen him so angry. I think they're finally waking up." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I'd been trying to shake my parents out of Morgan's spell for years, but nothing ever seemed to stick. If this was the moment, maybe the fight had been worth it. "They want a meeting," Grandma added. "All of you, Morgan included." I exhaled slowly. "I'll be back in 3 weeks. Tell them to come to my place the day after I land." As we wrapped up the call, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked different, not physically, but there was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. A steadiness, a refusal to fold. I glanced at the clock. My driver would be here in 40 minutes to take me to JFK. The Maldives were waiting, and whatever happened at that meeting in a few weeks, I knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the opening move. Because here's the thing, when you stop playing someone else's game, they don't just give up, they regroup. They come at you harder. And I had a feeling Morgan wasn't done yet. And if you think the legal notice was the end of this story, you're wrong. What happened after I came back? That was the real storm. Stay with me because the twist that came next made everything so far look like the calm before it. I zipped up my suitcase and set it by the door, the morning light starting to creep into the apartment. It felt like the first clean breath I'd taken in years. At 8:10 a.m., the driver texted he was outside. I grabbed my coat, passport, and carry-on. As I stepped into the hallway, I left my phone on silent. Let the messages pile up. Let them stew. I had a flight to catch and an ocean between me and the Harper family drama to enjoy. 3 weeks later, I stepped off the plane at JFK to the kind of winter cold that slaps you awake. The Maldives felt like a distant dream now, the turquoise water, the quiet mornings, the weightlessness of being far from everything. But as soon as the jet bridge air hit my face, reality was back. Grandma had been right. My father's voice on the phone after Thanksgiving had sounded different, clipped sharper. Something had cracked in his blind loyalty to Morgan. My mother, though, was harder to read. She'd oscillated between defensiveness and brittle silence, the same pattern she'd kept for years. The meeting was set for the next day at my apartment. That alone was unusual. My parents never came down to the city unless absolutely necessary. This time they'd asked to bring Morgan. I didn't object. The following afternoon, I opened the door to find them already waiting in the hallway. My mom looked smaller somehow, her hair pulled back in a way that aged her 10 years. My dad's shoulders were hunched, his eyes tired but alert. And Morgan was almost unrecognizable. No designer coat, no heels, no perfectly styled hair. She wore a plain sweater and jeans, her face bare, her expression stripped of the usual confidence. We stepped inside, and before anyone could start the usual small talk, I said, "Let's get to it." I moved to my laptop, clicking open the presentation I'd prepared. 3 documents filled the screen, a property listing, a business plan, and a glossy brochure. Option 1, I said, keeping my voice even. Sell this house. It's smaller, affordable, and well within budget if you sell most of the furniture and certain luxury items. I didn't look at Morgan, but the implication hung heavy. Click. Option 2. Dad. This is a full plan for the accounting firm you've talked about starting for years. I've run the numbers. If you take this path, you can rebuild a steady income. Click. Option 3. Morgan. This is a treatment center specializing in financial therapy and compulsive spending. They also deal with pathological lying. The program runs 90 days. It's the only reason I got the credit card companies to hold off pressing charges for the accounts you opened in Mom and Dad's names. Silence stretched between us. My father was the first to break it. "I didn't know half of what you showed me, Danny," he said quietly. "We've been blind, foolish." My mother's eyes filled. "When we found those cards in your name, Morgan, you could have ruined us." Morgan shifted in her seat, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles whitened. "Why are you even helping me after all this?" I looked at her fully for the first time. She wasn't the hurricane I'd known for years. She looked like someone who'd been standing in the wreckage long enough to finally see it. "Because you're my sister," I said. "And I believe there's still a version of you worth saving. But you have to choose it." The air felt thick in that room. My father cleared his throat. "We've decided to sell the big house," he said. "Your mother and I, we need a fresh start." Morgan's voice cracked, and me. "That's on you," I said. "If you take the program, I'll help fund it. But there's no more bailouts, no more free passes. Not from me, not from them." She looked down, then nodded. "I'll do it. I don't want to be this person anymore." I believed her cautiously, but the real test was still ahead. The agreement was set, but it wasn't going to be some vague promise that faded the moment people left my apartment. I'd seen that pattern before: tears, apologies, big declarations about changing, followed by the same behavior on repeat. Not this time. I pulled out a printed sheet and slid it across the coffee table toward Morgan. "If you're serious, you'll sign this now. These are the conditions." She looked at it warily before picking it up. Her lips moved as she read each line. Immediate enrollment in the 90-day residential program, no delays, no excuses. No personal credit cards, no new loans, all financial transactions to be monitored by a court-appointed counselor. Full repayment plan for debts in Mom and Dad's names documented and approved by me and the credit companies. Zero access to Mom and Dad's accounts, retirement funds, or home equity permanent restriction. Mandatory family counseling once a week during treatment and for 6 months afterward. Her eyes darted up at me. "This is intense." "It's reality," I said. And it's the only reason you're not facing legal charges right now. The credit companies are holding off because I convinced them you'd comply. But if you break even one term, the deal's gone. She opened her mouth, but my father raised a hand, something I'd never seen him do to her. You'll sign it, Morgan. We're done protecting you from yourself. There was a long pause, then she scribbled her signature at the bottom. I watched the ink dry like it was a seal being pressed into stone. Good, I said. You check in Monday. I'll cover the initial cost, but after that the program will work with you on a budget plan using your own income. And when you come out, you'll live within your means, or you'll live alone. She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just about money. It was about losing the control she'd held over all of us for so long. Turning to my parents, I pulled up the second document. Here's the listing for the smaller house. It's ready to move on. The longer you wait, the more the market shifts, and you need the equity now. My mom looked at me, voice trembling. We don't deserve this help. This isn't about deserving, I said. It's about breaking the cycle before it swallows all of us. You're starting fresh, and that means making hard choices. We spent the next hour going over logistics dates for the move timelines for the firm my dad wanted to open the steps to get Morgan admitted to the program. There were no raised voices, no tears, just the quiet hum of decisions being made in the open for once. But as the meeting wrapped up, I caught Morgan lingering by the door. She glanced over her shoulder and asked almost in a whisper, "Did Grandma really change the trust?" I allowed a small smile. No, but you needed to believe she could. Now you know exactly what's at stake if you keep going down the same road. She gave a short nod, almost like she understood, then stepped into the hallway. When the door closed behind them, I stood by the window, watching snow drift against the glass. For the first time in years, I felt like the balance in our family had shifted not in my favor, but towards something healthier. The day Morgan checked into the program, the air in my apartment felt lighter, almost as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for years. My parents had already signed the papers to list the Vermont house, and Dad was knee-deep in planning the launch of his small accounting firm. For the first time in a long time, movement in the family wasn't about patching over Morgan's mess. It was about building something new. Still, I knew better than to let my guard down. Change this big doesn't come without pushback. And Morgan. She'd always been a master of finding cracks in the wall. I visited the treatment center with my parents that Monday morning. The place was calm, almost spa-like, but with a firmness in the staff's eyes that told me they'd seen every trick in the book. Morgan stood in the lobby wearing simple sweats, no jewelry, hair pulled back. She looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in presence. "You really think this is going to fix me?" she asked, her voice quiet enough so our parents couldn't hear. "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "I think you're going to fix you if you decide you want it badly enough." She didn't reply, just gave a curt nod and turned to follow the intake counselor down the hall. That night back in the city, I sat at my desk with the final signed copies of all the agreements. I should have felt a clean sense of closure. But instead, there was a flicker of unease. It was too smooth. For Morgan, accepting limits without a fight was like holding her breath. It could only last so long. The next week proved me right. A call from the program director confirmed that Morgan had tried to convince another patient to pass her a phone. The staff shut it down immediately, but it reminded me exactly who I was dealing with. And here's where I need to be honest with you. Moments like that are when doubt creeps in. Did I push too hard? Did I cross from holding her accountable into controlling her? Or was that just the voice of old habits, the one that's been trained to feel guilty for drawing lines? Tell me this, if you had someone in your life who kept testing the edges of every boundary you set, how far would you go to enforce them? And at what point do you walk away completely? I'm curious where you'd draw your line, because mine is about to be tested in ways I didn't see coming. That's the thing about cycles, you can disrupt them, but breaking them entirely. That takes more than a single confrontation or even a few legal papers. It takes vigilance. It takes a willingness to be the bad guy for as long as it takes. And as much as I wanted to believe the hardest part was behind me, I could feel it in my gut. Something else was coming. Something bigger. 2 weeks into Morgan's program, I was starting to believe maybe, just maybe, she was taking it seriously. The weekly progress reports were positive. She was attending every session, participating in group therapy, even opening up about her spending triggers. My parents were cautiously optimistic, and Dad's new business plan was coming together faster than I expected. but optimism and Morgan had never been a safe mix. It was a Wednesday night when my phone rang. The caller ID read unknown, but the moment I answered, her voice spilled into my ear. "Danny, I need you to come get me, right now." I froze. "How are you even calling me? You're not supposed to have a phone." She rushed on, ignoring the question. "You don't understand. This place is—" She stopped short like she was searching for the right word. "It's making me crazy. They're twisting everything I say. I can't breathe here." I could picture her pacing, her voice quickening as she tried to hook me with urgency. For years, she'd used this tactic, create a crisis, pull me and reset the cycle. "Morgan," I said slowly, "you signed the agreement. You break the program and the deal with the credit companies is off. You know what that means." Silence on the other end. Then a sharp exhale. "You'd really let me get charged your own sister." "I'm not letting it happen," I replied evenly. "You are if you walk out." There was another pause, then the line went dead. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the conversation, her tone. I knew she wasn't telling me everything, and I knew I couldn't show up there just because she'd called. That was the test, hers and mine. The next morning, I got a call from the program director. We intercepted a phone she borrowed from a visiting relative, she explained. "She's pushing limits, but she's still in the program. Sometimes this is when real progress starts, when the fight is loudest." I thanked her, hung up, and sat there staring at my coffee. The truth was, I didn't know if Morgan was about to turn a corner or set the whole thing on fire. And maybe that's the scariest part about holding the line. You can't control whether the other person steps forward or back. You can only control whether you hold your ground. Because what happened next? I'll be honest, I didn't see it coming. It wasn't just about Morgan. It was about a piece of our family's past that I thought was buried forever, and when it surfaced, it changed everything. Stay with me, because this twist pulled the rug out from under all of us. I closed my laptop and looked out at the snow falling over the city. Somewhere, Morgan was either fighting for her future or scheming her way out of the work it would take to change. And me, I was bracing for a storm I couldn't name yet, but I could feel it on the horizon. It hit me on a Tuesday afternoon, right when I thought the week might finally be quiet. I was in the middle of reviewing contracts for a client when my phone lit up with a call from Grandma. Her voice, usually warm and steady, was tight. "Danny," she said without preamble, "I need you to come to my house tonight and bring those files you've been keeping." My stomach sank. What happened? She hesitated, then said, "Your uncle was here. He brought something, and you need to see it before Morgan does." 2 hours later, I was sitting at her kitchen table, the smell of chamomile tea mingling with the faint scent of wood smoke. Grandma slid a manila folder across the table toward me. I opened it and felt my breath catch. Inside were copies of old property deeds, loan documents, and most damning bank transfers from over a decade ago. Not from Morgan this time, but from my parents. Money had been quietly siphoned from a trust my grandmother had set up long before any of this started to fund. Morgan's first failed business failed. "This was before you even graduated college," Grandma said, her voice low. "They never told you because they knew you'd see the pattern." I flipped through the pages, my chest tightening. It wasn't just the money, it was the timeline. This pattern had roots deeper than I'd realized. The enabling hadn't started with Morgan's adult life. It had been cultivated for years, fed by secrecy and fear of confrontation. "Your uncle found these cleaning out some old files from Dad's office," Grandma continued. "And I think Morgan suspects they've resurfaced. She's been asking strange questions during her therapy sessions." I leaned back, rubbing my temples. If Morgan got wind of this before I confronted my parents, she'd use it either to manipulate them into caving again or to twist the narrative that she was simply following their example. That night, I called the program director and asked for a private meeting during my next visit. She agreed, warning me that Morgan had been testing limits but was still showing up for her sessions. 2 days later, I walked into the treatment center, the folder under my arm. Morgan sat across from me in the small, neutral-toned meeting room. Her eyes flicked to the folder immediately. "What's that?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened it and slid the documents toward her. "You ever wonder why Mom and Dad never held you accountable? It's because they were doing the same thing before you were old enough to drive." Her brow furrowed as she scanned the pages. For a moment, I saw genuine surprise, maybe even hurt, cross her face. Then just as quickly, it was replaced by something colder. "So they're hypocrites," she said flatly. "Guess I learned from the best." "No," I said sharply. You learned the wrong lesson. You used their mistakes as permission to keep making your own. But here's the thing, this cycle doesn't excuse you. It damns them, and it damns you if you keep it going. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. What do you want from me, Danny? An apology for being exactly who they raised me to be. I want you to decide whether you're going to keep hiding behind that or finally grow up. I pushed the folder closer. Because if you don't, I will take these to the credit companies and the family lawyer. And I will not protect anyone from the fallout this time. For the first time in years, she didn't have a comeback. Just silence. As I left the center, I couldn't tell if I'd just handed her the final push toward change, or the weapon she'd used to blow the whole thing apart. The snow had already started to fall the day Morgan's program ended. I stood outside the center coat collar, turned up against the wind, watching as she stepped through the doors. No designer luggage, no air of performance, just a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a face that seemed lighter. Ride home, I asked. She nodded, sliding into the passenger seat of my car. The drive was quiet at first, the snow hissing against the windshield. Eventually, she said, they call it re-entry. They make you write a plan for how you're going to live differently. I wrote mine. I just don't know if I can stick to it. I kept my eyes on the road. You can, but only if you remember what's at stake. And I'm not just talking about money. We pulled up in front of my parents' temporary rental, a modest place, while the Vermont house was in the process of selling. Dad was on the porch, bundled in a thick sweater, and Mom stood just behind him. They didn't rush down the steps like I half expected. Instead, they waited, letting Morgan walk to them on her own. It was a small thing, but symbolic. Inside, we sat at the kitchen table. No champagne, no welcome home feast, just coffee and the scent of soup simmering on the stove. Dad cleared his throat. We've decided. The house sale will close in January. We're moving into the smaller place and finalizing the business loan next week. I nodded. Good. Then I turned to Morgan. And you? She looked between us, then said, I'm sticking to the budget. No new credit, no big purchases. I already gave back the Tesla, sold most of the handbags. She swallowed. It feels like I'm cutting pieces off myself, but maybe that's the point. I studied her face for a moment. This wasn't the performative contrition I'd seen before. There was hesitation, yes, but also something like humility. Good, I said again, because the alternative is that folder I showed you, and believe me, if I ever have to use it, I will. Her eyes didn't flinch this time, I know. We talked for another hour, logistics boundaries. What would happen if she slipped? There were no tears, no raised voices, just a steady, almost business-like clarity. When it was time to leave, I walked her to the door. She hesitated, then said, I'm not saying I'm fixed. I'm saying I want to be. That's all I needed to hear, I told her. As I stepped into the cold night, I realized the war might not be over, but the battlefield had changed. We weren't pretending anymore. If you've been following this far, you already know this isn't the end. What happened after that, what came out when the house sale finalized, took this story somewhere I never thought it would go. And if you want to see just how deep the truth ran, you need to watch what happens next. I've got all the documents, all the conversations, and yes, every single twist that's still to come. I got in my car, the heater humming to life, and drove back to the city. Snow fell in heavy flakes, blurring the road ahead. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was driving straight into a storm. 2 weeks later, I stood at my apartment window watching the snow settle over the city like a clean slate. The Vermont house had officially sold the funds wired into my parents' account. Dad's small accounting firm had already taken on its first clients. Mom had started volunteering at a local community center, something she'd always said she'd do someday. And Morgan, she was living in a modest one-bedroom a few blocks from their rental, working part-time at a small marketing agency. No flashy posts, no mysterious business trips, no sudden luxury purchases. Just quiet. For Morgan, that was revolutionary. She still checked in twice a week sometimes to share a win, sometimes just to talk. The conversations weren't polished or perfect, but they were real. And maybe that's all I'd ever wanted, honesty without the performance. Standing there, I thought back to the Maldives sunrise, the way the horizon had glowed gold before the day broke. That trip had been my first step toward reclaiming my own peace. But this was the longer journey. Not just holding others accountable, but letting go of the need to control every outcome. Grandma called that night. You did good, Danny, she said. Sometimes the only way to save a family is to stop protecting them from the truth. I smiled, watching the lights flicker on across the city. Yeah, I said. And sometimes the best way to love someone is to trust they can face it. As I hung up, I realized the storm that had hung over us for years had finally begun to clear. And in the calm, there was space not just for boundaries, but for something we hadn't had in a long time: hope.